Where the trees parted, he saw a tower. It seemed suspended in the air, for it stood on an elevation, and the pines, which looked like blue-black fur, seemed to climb up it, but did not reach the top. Quite a strange tower, he thought. It was of old stone, calloused, as old things are, and that didn't just apply to inanimate objects. He was reminded of an old woman he had seen when he was young. Everyone called her a witch, sullen and ancient in appearance, like a stony cliff. Someone had said at the time that she was always old, at least 50, but never over 70. But in those days, it was the same as 90 now. The tower gave a similar impression. David raised his binoculars and looked at it closely, just as he looked at all the sights on a trip through Europe. Not that he wanted to or needed to, no. Rather, he did it because he had to. But the tower was peculiar. It was as if it had fallen into a mirrored rift in the spatial void, with only a patch of cloudless autumn sky behind it, flooded with the pale golden light of the setting sun. Almost only the silhouette of the tower was visible. But there was definitely something hanging from the narrow, high window slits. What was it? Something yellowish, like threads or curls of fog. Or maybe it was creepers. Shouldn't he look up the tower in a guidebook? No. Better to get to the small inn he'd been told was not far away, west of here. It would take about half an hour to reach it, by which time the sun would have set. David was not enthusiastic about the prospect of walking through the woods at night, at least not alone. The hotel made an ambivalent impression on him. He was greeted so cordially and spoken to so courteously that he thought he was about to be robbed, if not directly, then by charging exorbitant prices for his lodging and refreshments. But the evening passed very pleasantly with beer and a good variety of food. There was a fire, and it was just as well, for after sunset the cold, not very strong but noticeable, began to seep in from outside. David found a comfortable seat close to the hearth. After eating, he lit a cigarette and made a few notes to remember the day's journey. He needed it mainly to tell his acquaintances about the places he had visited when he returned. He suspected he would forget a lot of things otherwise. Usually, such things did not linger in his memory for long. When he had finished taking notes, he asked his host about the tower. "Oh, we don't talk about it," he said significantly. "It brings bad luck." "To whom?" said David, grinning. "Everyone. This place was the home of a witch in the olden days." "Witches?" The master, who was filling David's mug, straightened up and said solemnly, "You shouldn't even look at her, much less go near her." And then, contrary to his own assertion that it was better not to speak of the tower, he continued, "They say that in the old days, centuries ago, there was a creature who lived there in the service of a witch. It is said that she raised the creature by forcing it on a human woman, and all the while the mother carried the monstrous child in her womb. The witch fed it special potions and herbs that she herself grew in her creepy garden. Not surprisingly, the mother died as soon as the infant was born. The creature grew up under the witch's supervision, and doing her bidding, committed acts full of evil and filth." "That's a fascinating story," said David, who, to tell the truth, was bored. "There's more," said the master, staring gloomily at the low, smoky beams of the ceiling. The tower beckoned to the men, and some even climbed it. They were stupefied and attracted by the image of a beautiful young woman with golden hair who peered out of a narrow window and flirted with them. But when they reached the top and climbed through the window, "Ah!" exclaimed the proprietor, so sharply that David jumped up on the spot and spilled his beer, apparently a ploy to get him to buy another mug. "Ah, holy maiden, protect us! No one must look at the tower or go near it. I've already said too much, dear mister. Forget everything I've said." David dreamed that he was back at the tower, but in the dream he was much younger, 17 or 18 years old. His father was leaning over him, as Mr. David Sr. had often done in his lifetime, and exhorting his son, "Don't touch that, my boy. It is not worth touching." In fact, of course, it was worth touching. So beautiful was that golden, weightless cloud, like feathers coming out of a pillow stuffed with swan down, only if it had been the down of golden swans. "But it feels so good, Father," David replied, and grudgingly awoke in the tiny bedroom under the very roof of the Forest Inn. Midnight, his clock announced insistently, though silently. Now he would not be able to sleep all night. The next moment David was sound asleep and dreaming again. The flowing golden molasses. Of course it was sweet. He tasted it by licking it, then swallowed it again and again, and couldn't get enough. He had been deprived of sweets as a child. His strict father had overseen it. The only difficulty was that the molasses was also poured on David himself. He was covered in it. Oh, that would be a lot of work, but that would come later. For now, it was best to just enjoy it while he could. David opened his mouth wide and stretched his arms forward eagerly and impatiently. A new day came, bright as a picture book, and David awoke with a sharp, even wistful realization that he was to continue his exciting, adventurous journey across Europe. But, pardon me, what was it all for? If he were a writer, he could write a book about it, at least some sense. But he is not a writer, and not a playboy. That too would not waste time, and spent it at his discretion. But David? Why would he do that? Probably so he could bore people later by eloquently sharing scraps of memories about this and that. Nonsense like the stories the innkeeper told yesterday. After that, he had strange dreams. What were they about? Definitely about some sweets and something. Gold? Nonsense. David ate his breakfast in his usual silence, which his host did not bother to break. It was impossible to tell whether he was embarrassed because he had let his tongue slip the day before, or whether he was mockingly recalling his prank. It was possible, David thought, that his host had put it out of his mind, or perhaps he regaled every guest who spoke to him with such stories. After breakfast, David paid his bill and left the inn. The next stop on his journey was a town by the river. Both the town and the river had unpronounceable names. If all went according to plan, he would reach this town in 4 hours. In the meantime, David, pacing through the forest darkness, into which the sun barely penetrated, realized that he might have taken the wrong road. He suspected this, for the landscape seemed familiar to him. For example, that young tree over there, or that fallen pine tree, or that gap between the trees where the bright sunlight was shining through. David stopped and looked around unhappily, feeling rather irritated. What was it? The tower appeared before him, sunlit this time, still surrounded by the pines that seemed to be closing in on it. Yellow stalks still hung from its windows. For a while, David just stood looking up at the tower. It wasn't very far away, maybe only a couple miles or so. He noticed a narrow path that seemed to lead through the woods right to the bottom of a hill, not a particularly steep one. Before he knew it, David had gone in that direction and found himself at the beginning of a path leading to a small valley at the foot of the hill. To think what laziness and indifference could lead to. Had he really intended to go there? Did he really want to go up there and gaze at those unsightly ruins? And the tower would probably turn out to be ruins when he looked at it up close. But on the other hand, why not? He doesn't really care after all. Just another meaningless episode. He imagined writing in his diary. Went up to the tower. Not much to see here. Probably built in the 15th century, all covered in creeper. Not the most interesting scenery, as everything around it is covered with forest. The path and the climb up the hill did not seem too taxing for a man who had already traveled, mostly on foot, through 2 or 3 countries. Before noon, he reached the top of the hill, and a stone building loomed before him. This tower was interesting enough to say the least, but in what way? It tilted slightly, making it appear taller, though it wasn't really that tall. Well, maybe 35 feet. It was built of dark, smooth stone, polished by the winds and looking like the hard, smooth shell of some ancient sea creature. The narrow windows were quite high above the ground, but the distance to them was certainly not so great, about 28 or 30 feet. And they wouldn't be so narrow if you imagined you were looking at them at their level rather than from below. He couldn't do that. You don't climb towers like that. He didn't want to do anything like that. And what could be waiting for him up there? Bare stone walls? There must have been piles of worthless garbage on the floor over the years, not taken away by thieves just because it was useless. But there was a peculiar and strangely pleasant scent spreading around the tower. It was not at all like the resinous spirit of the pines, let alone the other odors of the forest, dry and damp, the odors of ripening, withering, and death. On the contrary, from the tower came, what was it? A honeyed fragrance that evoked the tantalizing sweetness of the Middle East. Were those strange creepers hanging from the top of the tower giving off that fragrance? There was nothing else around that could smell like that. David didn't want to go up and sniff the vines. They were no doubt full of insects and maybe even thorns. You never know what to expect from unfamiliar species. Their color, nevertheless, was quite beautiful. Not so much yellow as golden, an amazing, some kind of radiant hue. Despite his misgivings, he came quite close. It was impossible to see anything harmful or destructive in the plant, even under close scrutiny. The stems were smooth, silky, and not at all tangled, as if, what a strange image, the hair had been carefully combed by loving hands. Indeed, a fragrance emanated from these thick curls. David, tempted, bent down and inhaled the exquisite fragrance. What did it remind him of? Some kind of confection or a flower. Up above, it was not his imagination, something glittered. David jerked his head away involuntarily and stared up at the only window in the tower directly above him. As he looked closer, he noticed that, strangely enough, the creeper was definitely not growing out of the crevices between the stones, but was hanging from the window like some strange, airy veil that hung loosely over the tower wall. But what could it be? And his eye caught the movement. What was there flickering in the loophole 30 feet above him, white and moving, and, he was sure, alive? Frozen in place with his neck outstretched, David tried to catch a glimpse of a memory, a line from a poem or a song, the work of some famous and respected poet and novelist. James Joyce, was it not? Golden hair, dissolve thy window, golden hair. Something shifted, a hill of rubble or a stone, and David's foot went sideways. Losing his balance, he instinctively tried to lean against the tower wall, but his hands failed to reach, instead grasping a warm waterfall of creeper. How strong it was, how strikingly silky and soft it was, quivering with the golden vitality that overflowed from it. And the lingering fragrance now enveloped him on all sides, wonderful, like some mysterious potion. David felt that if he leaned forward and fell, the creeper would respond to his movement. It would hold him up, support and comfort him. With a startled gasp, David straightened up and leaned back. A cold sweat broke over him. The world around him shook, and the footing under his feet shook. He was pretty badly frightened. What was that, and what in God's name was happening to him? Damn it, exclaimed David. How ridiculous. The creeper was clinging to him, glued to his fingers, his hands, his arms. At once a multitude of stems were reaching for his chest, clinging to his clothes, to the skin on his neck, and all with stunning rapidity. Yes, it was sticky. Very sticky, like some kind of horrible glue. He'd definitely been foolish, but how to get free? The more he struggled and struggled, the more the vines coiled and entangled him on all sides. Then somehow they got to his hair, knocked off his hat, wrapped around his throat like an expensive fancy scarf, and the odor seemed too cloying, too suffocating, too nauseating. David tore himself up, wheezing, crying out for help to people who were not nearby, to heaven and the tower itself, to God. Nothing and no one answered him. There was silence, a respite. David stopped struggling, realizing it was futile. The innkeeper's words rang in his mind. You shouldn't even look at her, much less go near her. That meant that no one came to this place, and if they did, they wouldn't even look in that direction. They would not listen and would not rush to help when they heard someone crying out for help. Heavenly powers. What should be done? David tried to collect his thoughts. The situation is fantastic, but it can't be hopeless. He's a grown man, and he's got the strength of God. Surely he could reach his pocket knife, the only cutting instrument he had, apart from his teeth and fingernails, which it would be wrong to use. And the vines held fast. But there must be a way out. He had to calm down and think it over. Thoughts came into his head, but there was no escape plan. Instead, he imagined hanging here for weeks, months, slowly dying of hunger and thirst, or from the stinking, cloying poison. It was so horrible, and the picture was suddenly so vivid before his eyes that he almost missed the other new sensation. But then he noted a slight twitching. The grip became a little tighter, and the next instant a strong tug lifted him off the ground. Entangled in the curly net, he didn't fall, of course. Or rather, it seemed to him that he was falling upward. For a few seconds, David could not realize what was happening. But soon enough, everything became clear. There was no room for doubt. It was impossible to ignore the fact that the ground was sloping sharply downward, as was the hillside, the forested valley, and even the pine trees that grew lower down the slope. Old rocks rubbed lightly against him, but he kept sliding upward. It was as if the sky had parted, had grown wider, and staring at him with an eyeless but keen gaze, watched as the creeping plant, powerful as the arms of a giant, dragged him without apparent effort to the top of the ancient tower. Apparently, he had briefly lost consciousness. That's what happened. He only vaguely felt himself being forcefully squeezed, twisted, and pushed through the narrow, hard loophole. His knees and shoulders were particularly hurt in the process. But the bruises and abrasions were mere trifles compared to the rest. Wrapped in a golden cocoon of creeper stalks, coughing and struggling to suppress occasional gagging, David lay in a knotty, fuzzy ball on the stone floor slabs, burning cold. He could not move, not even to move slightly. It seemed that even in response to the involuntary spasms of his esophagus, the nets were squeezing him tighter, harder. It was dusky in the tower, though not total darkness. Daylight streamed in through a narrow window, soullessly illuminating David's golden fetters. Rays of light fell here and there on the stone walls. Perhaps, he surmised, this room had once, centuries ago, housed a guard post. But there was nothing here now but himself and the vines that entangled him. Involuntarily, almost accidentally, David jerked, rolled over, and struggled into the entanglements, or rather, tried to do so. As before, it had no effect. In fact, it was even worse. David started to cry, but managed to suppress his sobs. If he couldn't hold himself together, he would have nothing left. Nothing at all. Someone had lured him here. It was obvious. They'd used the creeper, treated it apparently in some obscure way, and given it the ability to attract and trap, and then brought up here, helpless as a fish on a hook. No doubt it would not be long before the scoundrel returned, or the scoundrels would return and charge him, perhaps demand a ransom. David groaned loudly as he thought of his 2 aunts, poor old maids, and the runaway uncle whom he had not seen for over 14 years. But maybe there would be another way out. And maybe he might even be able to escape when he was untied. David couldn't wait for his enemy to return. Let him release him, cut the damned bonds. He raised his voice, called out confidently, emphatically, without anger, first in English, then in the local dialect. There was no answer. There was no sound at all except, of course, the occasional gust of wind outside the window and the sound of birds' wings. Once he thought he heard a hunting dog yapping once or twice in the woods at the foot of the hill, in case they heard him if he called again. David pulled himself together, lying on the cold, hard floor, trying to forget the uncomfortable posture and the aching pain in his whole body. He must maintain patience, stamina, and sanity. The spasms had almost stopped. The cloying odor seemed to have dissipated a little. On the contrary, David now smelled a faint but heavy stench, the kind you get in closed and unventilated rooms with stale air, especially if some creature had died there years ago. He covered his eyes, The light was too blinding, and the shadows, by contrast very dark, seemed full of cobwebs, gloomy and impenetrable, except that it seemed that somewhere on the very periphery of his vision, when he tried to turn his tightly wrapped head as far as he could make out something that might have been a very low door, like an archway. Or it might not have been. David's watch had stopped, apparently as a result of hitting the window embrasure. But time went on, and the day was drawing toward evening. The sky outside the tower window was gradually turning a soft lilac color, and broad tongues of fiery red were creeping up from the side, apparently from the west. A little more, and it would become completely dark. It would be night. Had anyone come to check on his trap? David thought there was no one, but he seemed to be falling into a heavy slumber or some kind of trance. The nausea and suffocation had passed, but now he could not move or struggle at all, even if the restraints around him had allowed it. How strange, David reflected, immersed in a strange state, not quite accountable to him, almost narcotically lulling. How strange this is a spider's web. Doesn't this creeper look like a spider's web? Attractive and beautiful in its own way, but a sticky, insidious trap, a means of entrapment. And storage. Shouldn't we call for help again? If someone has entered the tower and remains below, they will surely come up to look at them. There will be threats, possibly violence, but if they hope to ransom him, they will at least try to keep him alive, which is the hope he has. If he could talk to them, he wouldn't be stingy with promises, however false and unbelievable, just to keep them interested. He had not yet given up. David shouted as loudly and yet restrainedly as he could. He waited a moment and shouted again. And yes, at last a faint but discernible sound reached him, a movement from somewhere below and behind him. If only he could turn his head. David ducked, but his neck was jerked and twisted painfully. He let out a cry of pain, of protest and frustration. But the movement, the sound, was repeated, then again and again. Footsteps, he thought, soft, quiet, some kind of shuffling footsteps. Either an old man or someone who was unsteady on his feet was scrambling, climbing toward him. Thank God, David thought. Thank God. Good evening, said David courteously, but coolly, in a tone quite worthy, he thought, to greet his ruthless invader. It was a long time before the footsteps reached him, and while they were heard, David shouted again. But now, having raised his voice, he froze, every vein quivering, every nerve quivering, waiting for an answer, any answer. Unable to turn and look, David mentally drew countless portraits of the man who had caught him, made him his prisoner. A bandit, or perhaps just a villager caught up in crime, or an eccentric landowner, a neglected child or adolescent, yet certainly an invalid, judging by the way he could barely drag his feet, and yet obviously dangerous and presumably feeble-minded. One must proceed with great caution. Meanwhile, while fantasizing thus and thinking it over, he felt someone's presence behind him. Whoever had been there was not moving now, probably trying to catch his breath after the climb, though no heavy breathing or tired groaning could be heard. Perhaps he was bothered by an old wound, something familiar, something he had long ago adapted to, and was now standing at the entrance to the room, inwardly exulting and marveling. Or something else? A robber regretting what he'd done, or concerned that the victim under the restraints didn't look so weak at all or incapable of... "What did you say?" David asked. The line sounded too hurried, and his voice betrayed consternation. "I didn't hear you," he added more confidently. Too teacherly, he thought. But at least the man who had come made a sound, a very quiet one. Not a word, no, it wasn't a conversation. Something in the manner of a rustling, whistling whisper. "Tell you what," David began. "You'd better tell me straight." He had time only for these words before the comer moved abruptly forward, finding himself opposite and nearer and quite beside him. Even earlier, standing outside at the foot of the tower, he had glimpsed something shining and white high above. Now he thought it was a mask, pale as marble, but shiny and glossy with the oily liquid it exuded. and this mask had nothing to do with a human face. It was elongated, long-necked, and as if blind, but the creature could see, with huge needles, long and thin, probably teeth, sticking out of it. The large, heavy torso, stretched horizontally, was clearly made of flesh, but stiff and pale. It glistened wetly and gave off a stench. Also, hands many dead pale hands, only 4 fingers on each, all moving and flickering and suddenly clawing at David, tearing at him, at first too fast for him to feel pain. But then the pain came. It came in long waves, and he cried out and struggled in the tight golden net that was like hair, but it wouldn't let go. It was David who was to surrender and be torn, and he surrendered and was torn, and his cry became a dull and meaningless groan, and then it ceased when the creature, which the witch had raised by means of the herb weed, crime, and darkness, with all its poisonous fangs and 32 claws, leisurely began to devour its dinner. As it had done so many times before that it was impossible to count.
Subscribe to our channel. Don't miss new and very scary stories.